Hi everybody, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. So the purpose of today's video is to continue on from my previous video about what is God, where I discussed over a series of 2 videos the personal versus impersonal idea of God and why I favour the impersonal idea of God. And I spent a lot of time in those videos talking about what I think God is not. But I didn't spend as much time talking about how we might come to understand God better, so far as we are able to do that. So that is the purpose of this video. There's a lot that I'm going to discuss, so this may well be the first in another series of videos on how to understand God. So the basic overarching theme of my previous 2 videos, which I will link in the description below, is that we cannot simply understand God as a supreme being, as a personal deity, because God is ultimately something that is unknowable. And from time to time, human beings have tried to represent or essentialize God, the unknowable, as something that is very familiar. And the most common way that we do that is by saying that God is a person like you and me. And so we set up an image which is inferior to the true thing that we are trying to get to, and we worship the image as though it's the real thing. And that's what is called idolatry in the Bible. And we avoid that by accepting God as something that is unknowable and something that is impersonal. And it might seem like a contradiction that I'm now doing a video discussing God, having established that God is something that we cannot know. But that doesn't mean that we give up knowing anything of God at all. There is something that we can know of God, and by knowing it we can greatly enrich our lives. Not only enrich our lives, but discover the very purpose of existence, the very purpose of our lives. So, a thing can be unknowable, but we can still have a concept of it. For example, I can see before me a coffee table. I have a concept of a coffee table in my head, and it is a concept of something that I can very easily comprehend with my intellect. A coffee table. It's something that has 4 legs and a flat surface. It inhabits the same universe as me. It obeys the same laws of physics that I do and that my brain does. And it's very easy for me to use my sense perception to get a complete idea of a coffee table. So it's a concept which I can comprehend easily. On the other hand, I have another concept in my mind of infinity. And that is something that, although I have a concept of it, I cannot comprehend at all. It is simply impossible to have any comprehension of infinity. It is completely beyond anything that we know as finite beings that inhabit a finite universe. We can't even hold in our mind an idea of every single star that exists in the galaxy simultaneously, let alone that which is beyond the universe altogether. And that's what it's like trying to comprehend God using the intellect. We can have a concept of what God is like, but we cannot ever intellectually comprehend that thing that we have a concept of. And there are other ways that we can approach, if not a complete understanding of God, then at least something of understanding God. But it's not using intellectual comprehension. If we want to know God in an authentic way, we need a different type of knowledge. I'll talk about that later. It may even be the topic of another video, depending on how long this one goes for. So, notwithstanding we cannot comprehend God with the intellect, with any sort of concept, we can nevertheless have concepts of God which point towards what that thing is. And the impersonal concept of God can really be known by its attributes. And if you look at the classics of world religion, you can really distill down what are some commonly accepted attributes of God. And those are that God is that which is eternal in the sense that it lasts forever. It is that which is without any form. It is that which is boundless, that is to say, it is without a physical limit or a spatial limit. It is that which is the source of all things in existence, from which all things come, and to which all things must return. It is also simultaneously everything in existence. As it is omnipresent, it is in all things, and it is all things. As it is all things, the divine is also that which governs the universe, gives rise to the laws that govern existence. And it is that which is the source of absolute truth, because it is the only thing in existence or beyond which has any sort of constancy to it, whereas everything else is liminal and will pass away. It has an absoluteness to its nature, whereas everything else is only relative. And God is often described in Vedanta and in the yogic tradition as bliss, and is often also described as pure consciousness. And there are some other attributes of God which are secondary attributes, such as the glory of God and all of that, but we won't go into that. We're just focusing on the things that describe divinity itself, which I've just listed. And so that's quite a list, and there are a few things on that list that would seem to contradict each other, or would seem to not necessarily be associated with each other. And so I'm going to try and break this down as much as I can. Break down all of these attributes of God and how they relate to each other and how they are describing one transcendent order of existence, one transcendent principle. And in order to do that, we need to go back to the beginning. This universe came from somewhere, and there have been endless theological debates about what came before the universe and what created the universe. Did anything create the universe? There's the old adage that is often used in theological debates that you can't get something from nothing. So what was the something that gave rise to the universe? And there's been a lot of logical fallacies that have been concocted to try and use a trick where we reach the outer perimeter of what we can know when we reach the beginning of the universe. And so we can then, not knowing what is before that, just substitute it with something silly and then not have to justify it, because there's no way that we can know that that's not what exists. And this is the way that the justification for a first cause in the form of a supreme being gets used. But sometimes there is a bit of logic, at least internal logic, to the sorts of arguments that are used to talk about a supreme being as being the origin of the universe, being that whatever is at the beginning must contain everything, and it must therefore contain consciousness, and therefore it must be an intelligent person. But that argument doesn't stand up to scrutiny when you look at the way that things actually work in the universe and the way that things unfold. And what we really see over the last few billion years is that we have a universe now that is full of complexity. It is full of the myriad things, as the Tao Te Ching would say. But that complexity, that reality of the myriad of things developed out of and evolved out of something very simple. And so it seems more sensible to say that whatever it was that was the origin of the universe, if there was anything there at all, it must be something very simple, and more simple in its properties than anything that is in the universe. And the scientific community now is coming around to the idea that no, in fact, you can't get something from nothing, and that although physicists have said that the universe came from nothing in the past, that nothing is not really nothing. It's not a something, but it's the absence of things and forms as we understand them in the universe, but it is not an empty vacuum. And there's been some work on this by Dr. Lawrence Krauss, where he talks about a kind of foam of probability that existed before the universe, from which the universe could spontaneously arise. And that's not identical to what I'm talking about in terms of God. That's more of a discussing a sort of primordial, quasi-material, quasi-energetic substance that must have pre-existed the universe. But what I'm talking about is the metaphysical reality that existed before the universe. And I don't mean metaphysical in terms of like Doctor Strange. I mean metaphysical in terms of the principles, the abstract principles which underlie everything in physical existence, but are ultimately beyond the laws of physics because they're not something that is material, they're not something that has substance. And this isn't a controversial idea in physics. We have ideas like time, which has no material properties, but it is a principle which governs everything. Metaphysics just tries to get down even deeper to the deepest principles that we have. And ultimately, God is something that is metaphysical. God is something that is of the metaphysical realm. And so let's take this idea that whatever gave rise to existence must be something very simple, and something which has an absence of the qualities that we would associate with physical existence. And let's see if the attributes of God that I listed at the beginning of the video match that. So we have something which is eternal. Well, what is eternity? It is the absence of time, the temporal dimension, which came about at the beginning of the universe, and not before. It is something which is formless and which is boundless. So it has no spatial conditions, it has no spatial dimensions. So it must be something which precedes space, which only came about when the universe came about. It must be something which is infinite, and since it is infinite, it must have come before the universe, in a manner of speaking, because there was no time, of course. And in the same way, it must still be there once the universe comes to an end. And as it can have an existence where the universe can't have one, in conditions that the universe can't exist in, it must be that from which the universe emerged. particularly because it is infinite, it must be all-encompassing. So whatever the universe came from, it must be that. As it doesn't have the qualities that the universe has of passing away eventually, and all of the things that comprise the universe of passing away eventually, it's not finite, so it's got constancy, and it is also that which is absolute, in that it needs nothing but itself. It is self-sufficient, and it does not depend on anything else for its own existence. You contrast this to the world that we inhabit, and all of the myriad things in this universe are all part of a duality. Everything that you can point to, every quality, every force, everything in the universe that you can point to is just one side of a duality. You cannot have up without down. You cannot have heat without cold. You cannot have light without dark. And so everything in this universe is relative, because it can only be defined relative to something else. It's because it has the properties of a thing. But the divine is that which comes before there were any things, so to speak. And so its existence does not depend on being defined relative to another thing. And so it's absolute in that sense. So all of those qualities of divinity more or less seem to be sound. But then we run into a problem when the ancient texts describe divinity as simultaneously being the infinite, but also being of this world, of permeating all of physical existence, and being one and the same with all things. If something is infinite, how can it simultaneously be finite? It seems like a contradiction in terms. And this is where our way of comprehending things starts to break down a little bit, as we start to approach the event horizon of trying to hold all of the things that divinity is in our mind at once. But the best way to understand this idea that divinity is simultaneously that which is beyond the finite world and the finite world itself is through a thelemic idea, which is the formula of 0 equals 2. So if you think about a mathematical equation, and mathematics is a useful metaphor here because it, like metaphysics, describes the most fundamental levels of existence, the most fundamental patterns and structures underlying everything, even more fundamental than the laws of physics. So if you take pure mathematics and you think about an equation, you have a sequence of numbers with different relationships to one another, and that forms a problem, a mathematical problem, which is a sequence of figures, of values. And then you have the equals sign, and then you have the solution to the mathematical problem. And the solution and the problem are one and the same. It's just that the relationships between the different numbers need to work themselves out in order to become the solution. But in effect, they're already describing the same thing. The mathematical problem and its solution are describing the same thing but using different language. And in the same way, we have the transcendent reality that is beyond this reality, which is the infinite, which is the nothingness, which is not really nothing. What some mystics called the Illuminated Void. And we might give that the signifier of the number 0. And then we have this universe, this reality, this physical existence, where we have a number of distinct phenomena which are all divided into sets of dualities which are trying to resolve each other. This is the Taoist conception of the universe. And you might give that the attribute of two to describe the dualistic nature of the universe. And of course, if you have two polar opposites and you combine them, you get the cancelling out of one and the other. If you have one and negative one and you add them together, you reach zero. To use an example from physics, if you have a particle and its corresponding antiparticle, when they annihilate, they create pure energy. If you have a positive and a negative charge, they neutralize each other. And so, if you were to solve the equation that is all of the myriad things of the universe, you would arrive at zero. You would arrive at nothingness. And so, by using the analogy of the formula of 0 equals 2, we can see how the infinite, the formless, boundless infinite, is simultaneously one and the same with the world of form that we inhabit. We're just looking at it from a different perspective. Another attribute which is often given to the divine is that it is pure consciousness or pure awareness. Now, this is a tricky one because a lot of people look at this attribute of God and they use it to say that everything is consciousness, that somehow the intelligent awareness that we have as human beings is all that really exists, and the whole universe has this kind of human-like intelligence. And it's really starting to approach essentializing God as something that is personal again. It's just that you have a disembodied brain, or it's just that you have a disembodied mind rather than somebody that's an invisible man. And so we need to be careful when we think about divinity as pure awareness, because this human consciousness that we have is something which has only existed for a couple of million years max. Before that, there was no such phenomenon. It's dependent on a very specific set of material conditions, and it cannot arise without those conditions. And nothing like the intelligence that we have now existed beforehand, because of course the universe was simpler then and this level of complexity hadn't evolved yet. So we're not talking about that when we talk about God being pure consciousness. At the root of our minds, when we strip away the contents of our consciousness, all of the workings of the mind, all of our thoughts, what we are left with is a pure awareness. And that pure awareness is really a state of pure being in its essence. And that pure being that is at the core of us is something which is completely empty. It is one and the same with that void, the boundless, formless, eternal void that we described earlier. And so when we discover that about ourselves, when we introspect using meditation and we discover what we truly are, and we discover that endless emptiness within, we realize that whatever it is that is at the root of our conscious awareness, when you strip away everything else, every other perception that we can have, and leave only awareness, whatever that is one and the same, has one of the same qualities as that description of the eternal infinite. And that is a profound thing to realize. And that is essentially what the mystics were getting at of the past when they talked about the divine being one and the same with pure awareness. And then a final attribute that the divine has is bliss. So why bliss? Well, because the mystics of the past who have undergone practices like meditation or yoga, who have united with that endless emptiness within and discovered that that is what they truly are, have had an experience of pure bliss. And so when we describe God as bliss, we're really describing how we experience God when we become one with that. Because it's an incredibly liberating and joyful feeling to feel like you have no other limitations and no other concerns, and that you're suddenly beyond all of that. And that's why God is described as bliss. Okay, so in this video I've discussed the attributes of the impersonal divine, of the impersonal God, and how we can come to some sort of an understanding of the concept of an impersonal God through those attributes. But what I've described is something that's highly abstract, and so it begs the question, why should I even care if God is so impersonal and so transcendent? How does that inspire me to be a better person or to lead a spiritual life? And that's the question that I'll tackle in the next video. So thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.